This is Caffeinated Risk, the podcast for security professionals by security professionals. Here are your two self-proclaimed grumpy security guys, Tim McCreate and Doug Leese.
Welcome, folks. For our next podcast, we chat with Darren Gallop, an information security and data privacy expert with a unique background, making him stand out in our industry. Darren's achieved a global perspective from over 20 years' experience throughout his career. He's fluent in English, French, and Spanish, as well as being a former musician. This creativity and innovative spirit helped Darren create world-class software solutions for music and cultural festivals like Coachella, Burning Man, and Bonnaroo. He's achieved an in-depth understanding of regulatory compliance frameworks and has guided organizations to create and implement security programs that adhere to GDPR, PIPEDA, ISO 27001, CMMC, NIST 800-171, and SOC 2. Darren's found a way to combine technical skills, creativity, and international experience, making him an invaluable resource for the organizations he's worked with throughout his career. And now, let's check out our latest podcast with Darren Gallop. Hi, everyone, and welcome to the podcast for this month. And I want to welcome our guest, Darren. Darren, this has been amazing to get you on board. So thank you so much for joining Caffeinated Risk.
Thanks for having me. Glad to be here.
Awesome. So just before we started recording, you and Doug were talking a little bit about history and backgrounds in music. Can you got to walk us through how the hell did you get from where you were early in your career to where you are today running Carbide? I got to hear this story.
I get this question a lot.
I was going to say, I can imagine. Yeah, I can imagine.
Well, I mean, you don't really know. It's kind of fascinating how in life, right, where you think you're going to land and where you land. For some people, it's pretty straight and narrow road, but I think for most of us, we end up in a place that we may not even know existed when we were in high school, thinking about what we're going to do when we hit university. So, I think back to like leaving high school in '93. Wow, a while back, and you kind of go to the guidance counselor. At least this was the way it went here in the day, and they take you through some aptitude test, and then they spit out a bunch of jobs that you should do. Right, like most 17, 18-year-old people, I didn't know what I wanted to be when I grew up. In fact, I was fairly far from grown up was a far road yet for me at 18. Yep. And, I went into university. I actually went into pre-engineering. My goal was going to be to get an engineering degree. And my original thinking was maybe I'd join the RCMP, get an engineering or physics degree and join the RCMP and get into stuff like crime scene reconstruction and vehicular accident reconstruction. But then I went to university, and it was the first time I lived outside of my parents' house and had freedom. And I was introduced to things like alcohol,
there we go.
and freedom and a lot of excitement and fun. And I'd always grown up in a musical household as well, but kind of seemed really illogical that you could make a life as a musician. Like it was, it was pretty obvious to me that it was like not even the 1%. I mean, it's probably like the 1 out of 1,000 or that might even be somewhat generous. But at some point in dropping out of university after 2 years of partying, I went on a Canada World Youth Exchange program and got to live overseas in Hungary for a while. And that introduced me to some pretty cool people that have done some pretty cool things. And I came back from that experience with, look, you spend most of your time working. I'm going to work in something that I love. I'm not going to worry about, figure out the money side, but let's focus all that time doing something we love. Mm-hmm. And then it was kind of a realization that like, well, if I don't try to live my dream that I have somewhere nestled in my head, I'm probably going to regret that at some point. So I decided I was going to be a rock star. So at 21 years old, I was like, not going back to university. I'm going to start a band. So did that, went through a couple of different bands, had varying different degrees of regional success, and then had a band that had a little bit of national success. But it was hard. It's, a lot of the times our dreams and reality are not necessarily what they seem like, and the grass can always be greener on the other side of the fence. So I started migrating more to the business side of music and to the production and the studio side because I got really tired of the road. And that introduced me to a whole other line of thinking. And I ended up starting a record label, which was my first real business. And, that was a blast. But it was 2006 when I started my record label. And I think it was 2007 and 8 when the entire economy just like collapsed and like Napster became mainstream and people stopped buying music. And, in addition to just how difficult it is to start an independent label, our distributor, EMI Canada, that organization was going bankrupt and was eventually acquired by Universal. So all of the things externally that could go wrong were going wrong amidst what was already a pretty hard business. And then I started my first tech company. So we were using a lot of like early stage SaaS cloud-based applications before people were talking about cloud applications. And I built a business. It initially started around building sort of process management for touring musical groups and record labels. But again, all the other musical touring groups and record labels were in the same financial constraints that forced me to move on from mine. So it was a hard business. We migrated over to music festivals. And that was really cool because it was sort of the beginning of a music festival boom. There was a lot of activity going on in music festivals. And within a couple of years of making that transition, we were supplying the back-end logistics software for some of the biggest music festivals in the world. Like we're talking about festivals like Bonnaroo, Burning Man, Coachella. We also had like other types of cultural events like Just for Laughs. We had sporting events like X Games. So we had a lot of really explosive growth into that niche industry as a software as a service provider. And I would say up to this point, my only relationship with cybersecurity was don't lose the tracks of the recordings that we're doing that are all digital. And, don't allow them to leak. So, my introduction to cybersecurity was very much around obsessive compulsive backupping of studio sessions and not having your studio machine connected to the internet and locking your facility and don't let anybody near all of the little demos and mixes and keep that stuff under wraps. That was my intro. And then all of a sudden when we started working with these big corporate events, right? So we're talking about AEG Live owns Coachella. That's a massive organization. Bonnaroo's in part owned by Live Nation and X Games is works its way. The top organization there is actually Disney. And so, we had these very sophisticated third-party risk management organizations come into our cool, hip startup where we're all like ex-music guys, long hair,
So the perfect security crew is what you're saying, right? Really. Yeah.
And I think we tried to initially sort of dance around it with our charisma, but we basically got our asses kicked by these security departments. And it was very clear to us we were given ultimatums and timelines to which we needed to get our shit together. And if we didn't do it, we were going to lose our core customers. And then in the midst of that, we had this massive deal that was coming in that would have been about a 10% annual recurring revenue increase in the business in one deal. It was a bulk of festivals in a whole region. And because we failed our security audit, they walked and we never had the opportunity to stand in front of them again. This was really the moment where it became evident as a CEO of a SaaS company that the importance of cybersecurity. And so I ended up dedicating the next 2 years to taking us from being ad hoc, kind of fake it till you make it security, which we all know where that gets a company, to building a sophisticated security program with third-party audit and certifications and all that kind of stuff. And that was the journey that really introduced me to it. And then I think just seeing how the buying process from enterprise organizations was evolving around how they looked at vendor risk. Mm-hmm. The Target incident was in and around that, and that was a major publicized hack. And it turned out in the end that it was the HVAC company, some small local business, that was the conduit that the malicious actors utilized to get into Target. it wasn't a failure in Target's direct security program, but just the fact that they allowed a vendor to go in there and that vendor brought risks to the table that weren't effectively assessed and mitigated for. And that really woke up the enterprise community around just like, hey, everyone's outsourcing the hell out of everything and everything's migrating things to cloud service providers. That's great. It's a lot of advantages to it, but we're sort of ignoring and naively not really thinking about or talking about the risks that brings to the business. So I saw that, and that was really where I saw cybersecurity as being, so, initially seeing it as being something we needed to do, to something we could use as a competitive advantage in my last company, to then seeing it as being potentially my next company idea, because it was very obvious all these forces that are coming about very quickly that are forcing organizations that were not thinking or caring or putting investment into cybersecurity, that are forcing them to think about it, was indicative of a massive market opportunity.
We're talking third-party risk assessments, it's usually talking about the data. You guys were dialed in from day one on reliability and availability. And it's kind of funny sometimes how people will do these elaborate third-party risk assessments, asking all these questions about data handling and everything. And it's like, does this service even work like you need it to?
Yeah.
They don't really stop and evaluate that use case or the viability of this organization actually showing up and keeping their stuff running for, 3 days in the middle of rain and wind and all the rest of that, right?
Unfortunately, like my perspective as somebody who works with a lot of SMEs that sell to enterprise and government, my perspective is that very few enterprise organizations actually do vendor risk management. What I think most of them do is it's pushed into a corner somewhere. It's a junior person. The person doing the risk is following some sort of baseline or standard that's generic. They don't know what the company is. They don't know what they're doing. They just have a requisition that marketing wants to buy software. They don't know what they're going to use it for. They're asking my customers what data is going to be stored and processed and what importance this tool is to the organization. It's not their place to determine what risk this is. We see a lot of this stuff where it's like, here's the questionnaire. It's the same questionnaire that a sanitary service company, a papers threader, a hosting provider, there's no knowledge, there's no tailoring to it. And what a lot of it looks like is, to me, from the outside looking in, from looking at it through my SMEs that are going through this process, I just think it's something that they're like, it's about compliance, it's about checking the box, and it's about theatrically creating what looks to be a paper trail that somebody did due diligence. So it's like, yeah, we got their SOC 2, we put the SOC 2 in the folder. Did you read the SOC 2? Did you look at or care about who is the SOC 2 vendor? What was in scope? Does that scope align with what's going on and what the use case is? I fear we're moving away from what's important, which is a risk-based approach. But unfortunately, a risk-based approach requires that it's hard. It requires work. So if you're lazy or you're not well equipped in your team, they can't do it. It requires knowledge and skills. So if you're going to think about this as something you want to pay the least amount of money for the people doing it, you're not getting the skill. So what you end up with is this theatrical journey that everybody goes through, where you cross a bunch of, you check a bunch of boxes and you put little pieces of evidence in a folder, and if something bad happens and it becomes a legal matter and a data privacy, you can say, well, yeah, here's all our vendors, this is all of the stuff, and there's the little letters, and it looks and it gives the appearance as though due diligence has been done, but really it's just a bullshit process that just eats up time and doesn't really give us what we need or what we should be needing as an enterprise, really assessing what this risk of this vendor is to the business.
That's kind of what I wanted to pull a thread on, if I can, Darren, because is that what helped you build Carbide? Because that's the essence of what you're trying to do, right? Is to get out of the noise and the bullshit and the checkbox mentality. Because Doug and I still see that today. It is still just a checkbox exercise from a security perspective.
My frustration is I feel like what I'm being sort of, because at the end of the day, you go out with a vision of what you're going to build, but really, if you want your business to succeed, you have to provide what the customer is willing to pay for. And so, sometimes I feel like, okay, we are always trying to drive this concept of things we believe in, which is the value of knowledge and awareness, the value of understanding risk, the value of habits in a business, the value of security and privacy by design, by default, as a cultural engagement across an organization. I feel those things are highly impactful, and they create security. Things happen without even thinking about them because people are aware and they're educated and they think about it, and there's time to discuss those concerns. I feel like we're spending a lot of time building automation toolage to facilitate bullshit, unfortunately, to be quite frank. I think all the companies in my space, that's what we're doing. And I get why our customers want that, because they want to focus on what matters, what's going to move the needle, what's going to grow their business. And, just some people will say startups don't give a shit about security. It's like, well, okay, historically, you're right. It was always break it, move fast, break stuff. And it was this adventurous thing. And then, but I think that's changed. I have customers that couldn't give a shit about cybersecurity. They're just like, what badges, what's the least amount of work and the least amount of money we can spend to get a SOC 2 badge or an ISO 2701 and get a big document of bullshit paper we're never going to read, so we can send over to our vendors that are never going to read it, so we can close deals faster. There's still a lot of companies, but there's also a lot of SaaS companies, and I'm seeing this difference where they actually do care. They actually do, they're reading those security and privacy addendums where they're making commitments to their customers, and they want to do it right. They realize they understand the risk. They want to do it right. And I understand for them, they want to have the education. They want to be able to focus on the risk, but they need the toolage to fuel the bullshit machine that they're being forced down in the sales process. So they need that they need over documentation, even on the things that are not really pertinent. When I look at that and I try to think about what I'm doing and how I'm helping, my fear for where this is going is, well, why does enterprise organizations always buy these new technologies from these 7, 8, 12, 15, 25 employee startups? It's because enterprise organizations generally suck at innovation, with the exception of some very elite organizations. Most of them are too riddled with politics and red tape and process that they're not splitting atoms and creating the new stuff. And so these startups are doing it because they have freedom. They're not burdened with politics. They're not burdened with red tape. It's excitement and fun and creation and innovation. Out of that comes these nuggets of gold. So it's how do you preserve that culture of creation while also reducing risks, but then you still have to, we're now having the enterprise organization deepen their tentacles into deepening, getting more and more data to put more and more artifacts in a file to show that they're doing this thing. Yeah, it's fascinating. I'm not complaining about it, because there's also again, if I put my business hat back on, there's opportunity in the madness. So I have to be careful not to wish away the madness, because if it becomes too straightforward and easy, who needs us or our software, right?
Yeah. Let's pretend you have an ideal customer that takes us very seriously, and they decide to go forward with a compliance platform or management platform like Carbide. What are the major changes you'd think they would need to embrace in their world that would have the biggest impact? If you were somebody that had to change culture a little bit, what would be the 2 or 3 things you think they should focus on to really get to where you feel they need to be?
Yeah, and it definitely depends on the size and the maturity of the company. I think a lot of the companies that we have worked with historically, they're not coming from an established security governance program in their business. So they probably don't have a GRC software. A lot of times they don't even have any policies. So they're kind of starting at ground zero. What I like about starting at ground zero is it's actually less work to start at ground zero than it is to go into something that a lot of money and time has been invested in, assess it, find the weaknesses, and then pave a path to correction. Sometimes that can actually be a harder. And then with all of the things that have been implemented, there's humans and emotions and money attached to having implemented that. And, you have to sort of walk through that journey carefully to not insult people. But also sometimes people want to it's like, well, your policies aren't that great, but why don't we start from scratch? Well, no, why don't we merge what I did in? Because I don't want to, I'm not willing to accept that we're going to deprecate all that time and money that I spent on that. So there's a bit of that, but I think overall, whether it's a small company just thinking starting to build a security program, and or a new company, or an established company that's already had one in various different iterations and has a larger team and stuff. Cultural change is easier when you're small and new because you don't have a deeply ingrained culture, and nowadays we're seeing startups as few as three or four people going ahead and getting a SOC 2 because they won't be able to even do a proof of concept deal with a vendor. They won't even be able to get a testing contract on their software without having a SOC 2 or an ISO 27001 certification. Like I have a customer right now, we're getting them ready for a SOC 2. We can't even include the infrastructure and the software in the scope because it doesn't exist yet, right? But in order for them to even start the 6-month sales process to get into POC mode, so we're doing the SOC 2 scope on their business practices. Well, they're not even a business. They don't even have customers. So it's like we're crafting future documented, right? But interestingly enough, the value in that, if you can do that in a light and efficient way, is if you're starting a business and you're already thinking about the security and privacy and you're educating those founders and those early employees at that stage, if you do that right and you set a practice in there, then you're just going to be a secure business if you keep up with that. And when you go into a business that has 100 employees and people have been doing things a certain way for 10 years, it's really hard to get people to change. Mm-hmm. It has to start in documentation. It has to align with business goals and objectives. It has to be over communicated, and it has to come from the top. And so I actually believe what's going to happen, and there might be a bit of optimism in this, but I do think this is going to happen at least in some degree, and I'm seeing it in some organizations that I've been working with from them being a couple of employees and 2 founders to being 30 or 40 or 50 employees, is the idea that security will not security not as a bolt-on. So actually embedding security in culture, having it in so risk assessments aren't an annual activity that you begrudgingly do because your auditor is going to look for the evidence that you did it, but it's baked into your agile process. So you have an agile product process where you have these different stage gates. So it's okay, what is the problem we're solving? Okay, what do we need to store and process? What are the risks to what we're going to do here? There. So if you right. you haven't even necessarily even written out drawn out what this product is going to look like, but you understand what it's going to do, what the stakeholders are, what's going to be needed, and you have this stopgap process. But you get to a point where if you have a culture of security and you have a good training program, this stuff is not rocket science. No insult to anybody in the cybersecurity industry. A lot of the stuff is, once you know the environment you're working in, it's common sense, and the environment could be HR. So if you're a company that has security in its culture and by design, and you're building your HR processes, you're thinking about, how do you validate that the person is who they are? What risks does the person bring to the table? Yeah. What do they need? You start to build this stuff in, and I think that future is one where it's not, all these department heads and then the cyber team. I think there's a future where cybersecurity becomes something that leaders and managers and all people in the business have some natural knowledge of, like, so you're a software developer, well, clearly you know OWASP and you've got lunch and learns, you know how to build, you know the difference between secure and insecure code, and you know what the threat trajectories are in code. If you're an HR, you know those things. So I think that is where we're going to go. And you know, there's going to be more and more, you're going to see more and more people in other roles go out and get cyber education, right? Like, I think, like, wow, imagine having a VP of product in a SaaS company that has, you know, some cyber courses in their degree, or they have a CISSP, or they've worked in, they have experience. Like, that's very valuable. And what it means is you're going to build, that person's going to make sure that we're building a process where, you know, sure, we're still going to do our vulnerability scans and our pen tests and our code tests, but there's going to be so much baked in security all through the process that you're not going to be finding these major, like we see it all the time. Somebody finishes a product, they already have a million contact records in it, and you're looking at all the decisions they made, and it's like, wow, like, you guys got a lot of work to do. Like, you guys.
Yeah, no kidding.
So I think, like, that it really is about the leadership of the organization, understanding what security governance is, the importance of security, and prioritizing and integrating security awareness, security assessments, not as afterthoughts, but build them into the business functions, build them into the processes, and they become part of the process, not a standalone set of policies. Security and privacy is designed into your organizational policies, into your organizational procedures.
Do you think that is that we're going to get there? Like, we've been trying to get there for what? I've been doing this for 43 years now, and I've only seen a few get there. But do you see, or where do you see the change or the pivot? Where do you see the time in the future where that's going to become more recognized, or that's the normal versus where we are today? Because we still have that culture of where they don't accept security as it. But do you see, or where do you see the change that's going to have to happen for companies to really focus on the culture and the human element for that security program?
So I think just the fact that, like, we used to think about IT as like a department, right? But if you go back 40 years ago, most people weren't working on computers. They were pushing paper, and then IT was the new thing that came in, and it was complex, and you needed to have a certain skill set. And you know, quite the reality now, there's lots of companies that are built, they don't need an IT department, they don't need an MSP. Like, they're using all these cloud tools that are pretty standard and simple. They need somebody that understands how to configure them properly. But more and more tools are becoming security by default. Like, if you bought a MacBook Pro 10 years ago, it didn't come encrypted. It didn't come with any of those security features on by default. They were things you could turn on if you had the know-abouts to do so. But now it's generally, you know, a lot of the devices are much more hardened by default. I think we're going to see that trend. Same with SaaS companies, right? So, you know, the cultural difference too, it kind of comes back again. I think it's the new companies that are starting out with a culture of security. Those companies will mature to be secure by design companies. I don't know, like, talk about the company that's been around for 40 years that still hasn't gotten it. That's you know, change. That's a change. That's a more of an emotional intelligence leadership exercise than it is a cybersecurity exercise. And again, like, you know, when I talk to young aspiring cybersecurity folks that are trying to get in the industry, and they're like, well, what do I need to do? It's like, well, you probably should focus a bit on your soft skills, because if you're just the IT guy coming in and hammering your fist on the table and talking and nerd and saying all these acronyms that the sales and marketing part doesn't understand, they're just going to patiently wait for you to leave. You know, and so, like, we do, like, change happens through communication and leadership, and you know, some organizations are not. It's not going to happen. I think, you know, some will. I think a lot of the newer organizations are just going to do it inherently.
Right.
I just want to touch back on one point, because we were talking about the organizational disconnect, and you know, I'm reminding people lately that communication is only complete when the receiver understands what you're talking about. So when you brought up the marketing people waiting for the nerd to leave. I kind of chuckled. It's like, yeah, this is way too close to home.
It's starting to feel personal now, yeah. Yeah.
You work with a lot of compliance folks and things like that as well. Do you think there's also a place for them to learn how businesses operate?
100%. I had a really funny encounter. I do a little bit of work locally volunteering for some of the new Canadians coming into my region to sort of help integrate them into the culture and the business community. And I met a young guy, super smart, has a business degree and a bunch of IT certs and really wants to double down in cybersecurity. And the Canadian government wouldn't let him study cybersecurity at university because they said that his background being in business wasn't applicable to cybersecurity.
Are you serious?
Oh, yeah. No,
oh, my God.
You can't write this shit. You can't write this shit, right?
What the hell is wrong with this place? Like, wow.
At the end of the day, yes, you if you don't understand, like, business is what, like, the most secure thing is to just close the business, right?
Yeah.
So, like,
yes. Sure. Not a lot of profit.
There's not, nobody's going to get paid, but it's the safest thing to do, right?
Yeah.
100%.
And so your job in any cybersecurity role, you're going to work at a business. Mm-hmm. Well, the goals of that business are critical. You need to find a way that you can build security controls to protect the core assets, and you can help senior management make decisions on the risks they are or are not going to take. They're going to take risks. And so, and if you don't understand business, I don't understand how you can be effective.
No, and I'm with you, Darren. I think you've just validated the last 20 years of my career. So thank you for that. I appreciate it, right? Because we've been talking about this since 2005, this idea that it's the business that runs the business. The business accepts the risk, but it's our job as security professionals to identify it. Yeah. That's our job, right? I found an old T-shirt from a company where Doug and I worked. As I was leaving, everyone took me out for lunch, and it was team, we don't sign shit. And because that's exactly it. It's not our job to accept the risk, right? It's our job to provide it and to work with them to mitigate it, but it's not our job to sign off on that.
Right. I had a customer the other day. I was like, well, we think you should be signing off on our risks. I was like, I'm your third-party consultant. I'm not signing off on anything.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly. No, thanks so much for this. This has been awesome, Darren. Thank you for all your time on this. And thank you for validating a lot of the stuff that we've been talking about here on Caffeinated Risk for 4 years, is that this is the path that we need to take. And fingers crossed, when you get a chance to talk to the next person immigrating into Canada, someone will actually listen and let them come into cybersecurity with a business background. That would be awesome.
I agree. I second that.
That would be awesome. Thank you, sir, for this. I really appreciate it.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Great chatting with you all.
Yeah.
Thanks for listening to the latest podcast from Caffeinated Risk. Make sure you visit our website, caffeinatedrisk.com, to stay up to date on what we've been working on. Our website has bios of our podcast guests, posts about topics we're passionate about, and even a library of reference material we find valuable in the work we do every day. And don't forget to subscribe to Caffeinated Risk on your favorite podcast service. This way, you'll be notified when we release our next podcast, and you can listen to our previous guests just in case you missed them. Thanks so much for listening to Caffeinated Risk.